Now we turn to post-traumatic stress. In this Daily Mail TV exclusive, former Washington Post foreign correspondent Hugh Naylor says covering war in the Middle East for the newspaper contributed to his life spiraling out of control. He says sex, drugs, and alcohol were his only way to cope with the horrors that he witnessed on the front lines of the fighting.
I would just have a shot of tequila, then 3 shots of tequila. Then I'd go in the bathroom and do 6 lines of cocaine and then 10 lines of cocaine, and I'd come out and have more alcohol.
Hugh Naylor is describing his typical behavior after reporting on some of the most gruesome bombings and battles in war zones across the Mideast.
I'll never forget in Gaza, there was a bombing, and I remember seeing an apartment building that was totally obliterated, and I remember a man who was standing over these holes in the ground, and he was putting arms and legs into these graves, and it was kids and small body parts, big body parts of adults, and he was crying, and it was pretty traumatic seeing that. I had a militant rebel put a gun to my forehead in Syria, I think just because he was totally PTSD'd and crazy. It was terrifying and certainly traumatized me for a long time.
The 39-year-old who spent 10 years covering such devastating death and destruction turned to fast fixes to ease his own PTSD.
I self-medicated and I drank heavily. I consumed a lot of drugs. It was mostly just cocaine. That was my drug of choice. And then wind up in my bed at 9 a.m., still awake, my heart racing. I'm sweating, feeling pretty terrible.
And alcohol and drugs weren't Naylor's only coping mechanisms.
I sort of escaped into sexual pursuits. Yeah, I got to the point where I was almost addicted to Tinder. I was trying to hook up with as many women as possible.
Naylor worked for the Washington Post for the last 2.5 years of his stint in the Mideast. He claims as he grew more depressed and traveled further down the road to addiction, the Post failed to provide him adequate health insurance to cover the PTSD therapy he badly needed.
I have a tremendous amount of respect for my colleagues at the Washington Post. It's a great newspaper, but at least a quarter of the foreign correspondents of the Washington Post aren't technically employees. They're something like glorified freelancers where they don't have access to the union, they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to the 401k, yet they're being exposed to dangerous situations. And they're being asked to dress and act like normal correspondents. If you're gonna call somebody a correspondent and you're gonna give them all the bells and whistles of being a correspondent and then send them into dangerous places, then treat them like a correspondent.
Naylor also believes Post owner billionaire Jeff Bezos should step in and do more for his employees.
For the richest man in the world to own a newspaper that creates this bizarre sort of dichotomy, it's exploitative. And it's unfair to a lot of the journalists who are sacrificing a lot of the benefits that they should be receiving and that their other colleagues at the Post are receiving. It's discriminatory, and I think Jeff Bezos needs to change that, and I think the editors of the foreign desk of the Washington Post need to change that.
Naylor is no longer a foreign correspondent, but he is writing a memoir about his war coverage.
I want to show an unvarnished version of how correspondents in the Middle East functioned and lived during the Arab Spring revolutions and then the civil wars. And a lot of us are flawed. We have foibles. And I hope that this book kind of shows that, A, journalists are humans and we're sort of unique creatures, but we sort of suffer like everyone else, but we tend to suffer in these really bizarre and wild situations.
A spokesperson for the Washington Post told Daily Mail TV, "We do not comment on personnel matters." Hugh says he's in a good place right now. He no longer does drugs and only drinks socially. He lives in Los Angeles and has his own consulting firm where he offers strategic communications advice to tech companies. All right.